demolishing the outlines of history and reconstructing a new We the People would intertwine men and women as a whole. On November 2, 1920, more than 8 million American women went to the polls and exercised their newly won right to vote, creating a political earthquake. Women challenged the natural order of society and proclaimed the right and responsibility to citizenship. Nowhere is this outrage more pronounced than in the remarkable, complicated, and inspiring story for women's suffrage rights. The story of banners, the story of marches, the story of fights. The rights and responsibilities that were theirs from the beginning. The 19th Amendment. The same challenge that natural rights ideals pose for slavery also pose for the widespread denial of rights to women. Instead of there being general recognition of the denial of rights, as in the case of slavery and liberty, most Americans believed that women's subjection to men was a matter of natural rights and law, and therefore legitimate. When the contradiction was explicitly asserted, most denied the need to extend full equality and citizenship rights to women, arguing that men were naturally the best guardians. Women were given a right and responsibility from God to take up a domestic role. Under these circumstances, few women, and even fewer men, challenged the separate spheres.
It really was not thought possible for women to be active in public life in the form of citizenship, in the form of full citizenship. But the revolution made people have to think about that. Like, what are women if they're not citizens? What is their civic role? And so some people began to think about women as, well, they're the mothers of future citizens. Their civic role is to raise virtuous sons who will be good citizens.
Although the issue of women's rights was raised in several states, there was no sense of responsibility to bring the suffrage issue into the national political arena. Men saw it as their right, and even responsibility, to exercise their patriarchal authority over women by prescribing every aspect of a woman's life. This was even reflected in the writing of the Declaration of Independence.
And when Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be evident that all men are created equal," he meant men. He also meant property-owning men. Jefferson did not believe women should be citizens. He didn't believe women needed to be educated.
In spite of this gentleman's agreement, a group of women with egalitarian thinking and female activism saw it as a right and responsibility to challenge the separate spheres and redefine the sentiments of citizenry. The demand for the enfranchisement of American women was first seriously formulated at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. The convention's prime organizer, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, wanted to encourage discussions regarding the social and civil rights of women. In view of this entire disfranchisement of one half the people of this country, the attendees saw that because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, it is their responsibility to insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States. Solidifying these principles, the leaders of the convention penned the Declaration of Sentiments, which addressed a wide range of issues, exposed the constitutional struggles with we the people, and most importantly, rallied women to take up a common responsibility to fight for both their natural and legal rights. Following a golden age of women's suffrage activity in the 1850s, the movement was temporarily suspended due to the Civil War. Women shifted their attentions from suffrage to the battlefields. At the war's conclusions, the issue of political equality of women was brought up, as it was inextricably bound up with the unsettling political status of former slaves. Frederick Douglass, a once staunch supporter of women's rights, asked the suffragists to accept exclusion from the post-war suffrage amendments rather than endanger the prospects of the newly freed black men. To resolve the abnormal position of the freed population, the 14th Amendment, for the first time in constitutional history, became gender-specific by including the word male. No longer was it implied that we the people meant men. Women's rights were now explicitly excluded.
And you know that because in 1868 you have the 14th Amendment says, women should be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizenship. And we know that right away Susan B. Anthony says, that must mean suffrage. And Virginia Minor says, that must mean suffrage, and the courts say, no, no, no. So they have to fight for it.
The passage of the 15th Amendment, a much more powerful constitutional defense of political equality, only deepened the anger of women's rights advocates because it did not include sex among its prohibited disfranchisements. Ultimately, this crisis split the suffragists into two camps: the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others refused to endorse the amendment because it did not give women the right of the ballot. Other suffragists, however, including Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe, argued that once black men were enfranchised, women would achieve their goal. Although both organizations were parallel to one another, the groups advocated different techniques on how to secure women's right to vote. Enfranchisement to both organizations was vital. Ultimately, the two groups would recognize their shared responsibility to women's suffrage and combine their efforts to secure the passage of the 19th Amendment. Women's rights would meet opposition. Anti-suffragists opposed all ideas of the ratification of an amendment that allowed women to vote. They believed women could participate in the political arena. However, the right to vote was not necessary to accomplish that. Ultimately, women were expected to raise proper Republican sons dedicated to the patriotic cause, not fight for rights. As Woodrow Wilson took office in January of 1917, suffrage demonstrators took up positions outside the White House, holding round-the-clock vigils, demanding the right to vote. In spite of the ongoing World War, they refused to step aside or abandon their responsibility to liberty. Women who lawfully picketed the White House, politely demanding the right to vote, were arrested and jailed. Their civil rights as citizens were violated. Obstructing traffic was the usual charge, but many prison officials, as well as citizens, considered the suffragettes traitors. Then, on November 15, 1917, under orders from W.H. Whitaker, superintendent of the Occoquan workhouse, 40 guards with clubs went on a rampage, brutalizing and beating 33 jailed suffragettes. For all the pain, this brutal night turned the tides. Less than 2 weeks later, a court-ordered hearing exposed the beaten women to the world, and the judge agreed that they had been terrorized for nothing more than exercising their constitutional rights to protest. By the beginning of 1918, pressure was mounting on President Woodrow Wilson to take action and support a women's suffrage amendment. Public sympathy shifted towards support of the suffragettes.
In the past, I think a lot of politicians were able to maybe give lip service to the women's suffrage issue or not address it at all. They could ignore it. It was very easy to do. But particularly by putting the president on the spot, able to garner national sentiment for the issue of women's suffrage. And then politicians that began to run for office, they ended up putting it on their platform, whether they supported or opposed women's suffrage.
On January 10, 1918, the suffrage amendment was brought before the House of Representatives. The proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution would grant voting rights to all American women. On the previous evening, President Wilson had made a widely published appeal to members of the House of Representatives, urging Congress that they had a responsibility to pass the amendment. Marginally passing by one vote, women's rights to vote passed the House and was brought to the Senate. Then, on September 30, 1918, President Wilson appealed to the Senate to pass the suffrage amendment, speaking passionately about the contributions that American women had made to the war effort. But despite the president's efforts, 2 votes were lacking to gain the majority needed to pass the amendment. It took a determined nationwide campaign by suffragists to secure sufficient support for the amendment. And on June 4, 1919, the Senate eventually gave its approval. Liberty prevailed. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution became law on August 26, 1920. As a nation, the story of the right and responsibility for equal suffrage involves many stops and starts, many shifts and many spills. Moreover, the exact terms and times of the triumph end were not and could not have been envisioned by those present at the end. Prior to the 19th Amendment, we the people was exclusionary, but the undying responsibility from leaders such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Alice Paul secured rights for women. The 19th Amendment, the rights to citizenship and the responsibility to liberty.